I grew up in Alaska and I loved the outdoors. I loved the forests that I saw up there and that I lived in, basically. When I was 17, I had a chance to be an exchange student in Australia. So I lived on a sheep and cattle station in the outback of Australia for a year and got really interested in rangeland systems. And I had always been interested in forestry, and with the new interest in rangeland, I ended up going to school at Fort Collins at Colorado State University in a double major, rangeland and forest management. And I really loved it, and I felt like it was a chance for me to sort of think about managing, the majority of the world's terrestrial systems, rangelands or forests, mesic or semi-arid systems. And so I kept on. I laugh when I think back on that. It seems so long ago, but it was actually a colleague of mine, ended up on my dissertation committee, David Williams, who's now at the University of Wyoming. And he said, "Jake, just do 1 degree at a time." I'm not sure that I truly did a scientific experiment to test a pattern or a process that wasn't part of my everyday world. So I would have trouble remembering that. But let me go to the first time when I think I actually really did research and true science was working in Kenya as an REU student. And there I was investigating the patterns of grass community composition, what kind of grasses were present in the stand of grasses underneath Acacia tortilis trees, these typical savanna, the umbrella trees that you see, those classic umbrella trees. And there are these interesting patterns where there's all this vegetation underneath them, but it's relatively dense out in the open spaces within the savanna. And it was a very obvious pattern, so we spent time documenting the pattern, and then we tried to understand what could be the cause of that pattern, and that's when I truly started doing science. I think it's the everyday, it's the everyday excitement. And I'm probably very lucky in many ways that I can use a term like everyday excitement. I think sometimes I have trouble sleeping at night because I'm excited about going into work the next day. Probably communication skills, I believe, would be really one of the most important things. Now, I know that there's lots of different scientists and lots of different types of people who are scientists and very successful scientists. And some scientists are very successful because they're very good at communicating in a written form. And they're good at communicating with, for example, the natural world if they're an ecologist. Understanding and sensing the patterns that are out there and the underlying potential processes, and then conducting science in a defined way and repeatable way to understand those patterns. So there's another part of communicating, though, I think that's really important to successful science. So if you don't write the paper, you're not going to be successful. But communicating with the public and with your peers and with resource managers, for example, as a scientist, it's really critical to get the information out there. Phenology is changing, and through time, there's a variety of different drivers, and some places are changing more than other places on the continent, and some organisms are more sensitive than others. But part of that milieu, that mix out there, all that stuff out there, all that biodiversity is us as humans. And we are part of the biological world and really dependent on it. And so if we understand the patterns that are out there and the underlying mechanisms, and we can project into the future, then we can start to adapt. Because if we don't adapt to change, then there is actually a great potential that we will suffer as a population, just like so many other natural populations. Probably the most important person in my scientific life would be Dr. Guy McPherson. I first met Guy at Texas A&M University when I started my master's, and I think I was really quite green then. I had been in Africa on a research experience for undergraduates program, studying trees and grass interactions there. And I thought I knew a little something when I arrived at Texas A&M. And it was a totally different environment, a totally different culture, a brand new university. I had very supportive people there. But when I met Guy and I was a TA in his class, we had long-ranging conversations, the kind you sort of imagine, about old professors sitting around in lounge chairs with pipes and a beer and having these really amazing conversations. This is kind of what I imagined perhaps when I was young and growing up. And so we talked about everything. Science has become a little bit rarefied from the rest of society and the entire human population. And truly, I think science and scientific understanding and the application of scientific knowledge are going to be critical to our continued success as a human population on a finite world. And so I think the thing that might surprise people, all those people in the world, is that science can indeed, A, provide that capacity, and they may not necessarily know that. So I'd like to be able to let people know, hey, we can work together on this. But second of all, that science is not any sort of mystery. There's one thing that has become really important to me, and that is a print that I picked up in China when I was there for the EcoSummit meeting a few years ago. And we went on one of those field trips that you go on when you're going to a scientific meeting, and we stopped at a printmaking factory. And I watched the people there making these beautiful prints, and I got 3. And they're small. And I needed to have them small because I was traveling overseas and I was going to put them in my luggage. And it's a beautiful print of cherry blossoms. And for a while, I was hanging it upside down. I didn't even know which way it should hang. But I have a very strong attachment to that one print. I spent 7 years at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And I really got into Americana music. And I'm not even sure how you would describe Americana. A little bit like Roots, etc. And it's just lovely music. Some of my favorite bands are Dawn of the Buffalo and Railroad Earth. And I'd never heard of them, and you've probably never heard of them, but check them out. They're absolutely wonderful bands, and you'll understand exactly what Jake's talking about when he says, listen to the song Goat by Railroad Earth from one live concert somewhere, and you'll understand exactly why I might play that in my lab.